Welcome back to the Church Resource with Dr. Chris Respass.
What's up, man?
And myself, lowly Reverend.
Whatever. Stop playing. Stop playing.
Man, it's good to be back. We've got some interesting stuff from the episode where we're kind of introducing you and talking about what it means to plant a church. You know, where you are, where you started from, and this one thing that you picked up on, discernment when it comes to picking and training leaders. Let's talk about that, because I think that's something, no matter our church size,
Right.
that is an existing challenge for all of us. And no matter how many times we've learned the lessons on picking church leaders, it's one that I feel like every time I go through something, I'm like, gosh, didn't I already figure this out?
Yes.
And no, I haven't.
Yes.
So tell me, what am I looking for? When you are, because you've developed a wonderful program for leadership development. Your church has a leadership academy that is part of y'all's ministry that is headed, I think that's by Pastor Tony's in charge of that. Yeah, Pastor Pettis. So when you are looking to get somebody into leadership,
Right.
what are the traits that you're looking for, and what's that rollout look like as you're trying to fill that leadership pipeline?
Yeah. So, and let me say, this is like you said, this is an issue regardless of your size, regardless of your tenure. I think we'll always have this challenge, trying to identify the right men and women to put on our leadership teams. It reminds me about Jesus, right? Like when Jesus was picking his disciples, his apostles rather. He spent all night praying, right? The Lord, the one who knows everything about us, he nevertheless spent all night praying before selecting those that would be part of his upper echelon of leadership. So it's something that's clearly important. And if nothing else, if Jesus had to pray, we need to, seek the guidance of the Holy Spirit.
What are you talking about?
Come on, who's going to work the nursery and the parking lot ministry?
Right.
We need to pray.
Yeah.
So for us, I think the thing that we have looked for the most is, first of all, you saved, right? I know this,
dude. That is so. It seems like it shouldn't even be a factor,
right?
But that is massive.
You gotta be saved, man.
Yeah, there's a church up here in the Denton area, the Church of Pecan Creek. Dr. Trey Talley's the pastor up there, great friend of mine, and Trey baptized 7 on a Sunday a couple of years ago. And I was like, man, 7 full, like that's huge.
Yeah.
To baptize 7 on one Sunday morning. And I was like, so were you guys evangelizing to him? He was like, bro, these are all people that had been church for most of their lives and realized that they had never actually been saved. They had never actually repented and believed, but they had come in, they'd kind of gone through the motions of it, and that there was this sort of epiphany that they had during their Bible study. They're like, hey, you know what? If this is what we have to do to be saved, I've never actually confessed that Jesus is the Lord of my life. I've never done this, and I've never followed in believer's baptism. And he was like, well, that has to be corrected if you're gonna continue in the pursuit of Christ. It's crazy, man.
It is.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful first point. You gotta be saved.
You gotta be saved.
Yeah.
you gotta believe. Because how can we lead people to places we haven't gone, right? So you certainly look for that, and we assume that to be the case. But that's not always the case, whether, I call it people getting hooked up backwards, right? They got baptized because, they went to VBS, or their grandmother and their aunt, their cousins, and everybody went down, and they went, but they never confessed. Yep. Right. So we got to overcome that. So you obviously want to look for people that have confessed Christ and follow that with water baptism. I think from a practical standpoint, the second thing is you got to look for people that respect and follow leadership.
100%.
And that's doesn't always need to agree, but you got to respect and understand that they're not the pastor, right? That they're not the presbyters, or depending on your denominational ecclesiastical structure, that they're not it.
Bro, this is so many seminary words right
Yes,
there. Yeah,
whatever. Right? They just got to know that they're not it, and they can respect the leadership that's in place and the direction. Right, so they got, be saved, respect the leaders, got to catch the vision, right, understand where you're going. From a practical standpoint, I think it's important that we look for people who are doing already, naturally, without any prompting, things that we want to see done, right?
Yeah.
So you already kind of see people demonstrating from a leadership, demonstrating leadership character. Right? So like what? Well, they show up on time, right? If the Bible says, let your yes be yes and your no be no, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so if they say they're going to be there at 8, they're there by 8, right? So they're prompt. If they're going to, say they're going to provide you something, that they actually provide it. In terms of how they interact with people, right? That you can see, do people gravitate to them? Are they are they winsome? Let me do it that way. Do they have a winsome type personality? Are they kind of folks that people want to gather around, right? If they've had responsibility for a particular project, are they able to build a team? I often, it's kind of going back to my church planting days. There are folks that, I would talk to pastors about church planting, but they can't grow a Bible study, right? Or they can't grow a Sunday school class. And I would ask them, like, how do you expect to grow a church if you can't grow a class, right? If nobody wants to take your class, can't get anybody to come, right? So they need to be demonstrating in some way, maybe not in some grand way, right? You got one talent, you just try to make one more, right? So it doesn't have to be off the charts impressive, but are they able to win people toward their cause, lead them in a plausible direction, while operating within the constraints that come from leadership?
Man, I think that's such an interesting point. Is we have seen so many folks that have this what appears to be on the surface as holy ambition, and then as soon as they get put in a position where in the business world, we refer to it as the Peter principle. Like when you reach your point of inefficiency in the business world, like that's where you get stuck. That's why so many of us have a boss that like is terrible at their job, is because he was really great when he was in your job.
Yeah.
But he's terrible at this job. And so they're not going to promote him, but they're also not going to demote him. So they just leave him in this place where he's like reached his, maximum level of inefficiency. So when we look at, like, for instance, Bible study leaders, and we had this issue with a few folks, is we got somebody that was excited. We had one guy in particular, and he was taking seminary classes. He was working towards getting a degree so that he could, be licensed to minister and those kinds of things. And when we had him in a Bible study class, he realized early on he was having trouble connecting with the people that were in his Bible study, and that became such a stumbling block for him that it went from like, hey, the end of January, he and I had breakfast together, and he was like, I feel like I'm having trouble connecting with the folks that are in that class. To 2 weeks later, he was like, I don't feel like I should be going to a church where I'm having to work this hard to connect with people, so we're going to go. And so we went from like, hey, here's a guy who's growing and developing. Now he's taking next steps to get into leadership. When 2 weeks ago, I get hey, we're in this for the long haul, this is it. And then a couple of weeks later, it's like, hey, we can't, this isn't what's going to happen. There were likely things along the way that would have let me know that something was amiss.
Right.
And, when I'm looking back at it, I'm thinking of like, okay, so where are the areas where I can take ownership of it? Well, one, when I was building that relationship, the relationship was all about how much he and I liked hanging out with each other, how much our wives enjoyed hanging out with each other, and the fact that we're all studying the Bible, but we weren't all doing it together. So there was one portion of it. We enjoyed each other's company. He had a lot of great leadership potential, and now in his new church is moving into those roles again, and is doing great. And I'm super proud of him. And then the next thing though was that once we put him in that role, that I tend to be pretty hands off,
right,
and not realizing that in the beginning, especially. And even maybe more so with the people that you have great relationships with, because they're not going to let you know whenever they need stuff, because they don't want to bother you, whatever, when you're the pastor.
Sure.
That there's a little bit of kind of micromanagement that has to take place in order to make sure that they are doing the things that they need to do, and that they're comfortable doing them, and that they have the proper direction. Looking back, I don't know that would have changed anything in this particular situation. I think God kind of put him where he needed to go. But in every situation since then, I've had to step out of my comfort zone as the leader in order to provide that extra support, which to me feels like micromanagement. I'm like, gosh, I don't really want to do this. I don't want all that, I don't want them to feel like there's that extra pressure. But every person that I've done that with has been like, hey, thank you so much for taking the time and investing. And I'm like, okay, well, it's my mindset about this that has to change.
Right.
How do you find the balance with those folks? Because like you're talking about doing the things that, the things that they're doing need to be the things that you want to see done.
Sure.
Right. How do you encourage them once you move them into a leadership role, or I guess how do you encourage them along the way into that leadership role? Do you give them directly something, or do you give them something small and then see if they can handle something bigger? Does it kind of depend on the situation? What's that look like for y'all?
Yeah, so I'm a lot like you, right? So that's why I can. I know, but you're not supposed to say that on film, because I tend not to be a micromanager.
Yeah.
I'm kind of like, here's the assignment. Here's where we're going. I'll meet you over there.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm going to trust you to do it.
I'm going to trust you to get there. And that has probably bitten me in my ministry limbs. More than that, and seeing the potential and it just not being realized. I read a book called Leadership in the 1 Minute Manager, and in that book, I think it's by Ken Blanchard. Don't hold me to that, but it's Leadership in the 1 Minute Manager. And in it, one of the principles that I deduced from it is we have to have a management approach that takes into account the uniqueness of each one of our, let's say, direct reports or ministry leads. In our church, we have different tiers of leadership responsibility and opportunity, right? And so what happens is, let's say I look at myself and I say, well, this is how I manage people. This is how I lead people. And so I have a general approach to everyone. Well, everyone has not earned the right to have the degree of flexibility that I'm willing to give them. Right. And so there may be some, superstars, and there may be some, more average, run-of-the-mill folks. But I would treat them the same. Right. I would give the one that has never done this before the same amount of leeway as the one that's been doing it for 20 years. Right. And so what happens is I'm frustrated with the novice because they're not operating in the way that I would expect them to do. And I'm frustrated with the superstar because they're flying outside of the boundary that I've created for them in my mind, right? And so all of them, as they're coming on your team, until you're able to figure out how much, if you will, rope or chain, how much leeway and flexibility that they deserve to have.
Yeah.
Right? You're going to find yourself kind of being in a pickle all the time, possibly frustrated all the time. So I think, we have to look at each ministry lead and manage them, lead them, guide them in a way that's commensurate with either their experience or their demonstrated handle of their ministry responsibility as it relates to what it is that you want them to do and how it is you're guiding them in their leadership. Starting off giving them smaller projects, for me, that would even come before they even rise to the level of leadership.
Yeah.
As I've said, in our church structure, we have ministry divisions. Those ministry divisions are led by a division leader, which is one of our senior pastors, our higher ranking pastors. And then under that, we might have a general ministry leader, say like our usher. We may have someone that leads our ministry, our ushers ministry, and then under them, you might have a team within, let's say, the ushers ministry that is also considered at a leadership level. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up.
Gotcha.
And so that tier 1 person, it just may be calling, the assignment they have is call their people every month, right? Or to check in with their team and make sure everybody's going to be, scheduled to serve on their appropriate day. Whereas the ministry lead for that, they're coordinating all that other stuff in addition to other things that may be related in our example to the ushers ministry, right? And so at each tier, the expectation is different, but the principle is the same. Follow through. Are you doing it in a timely fashion? And are you able to handle any interpersonal conflicts or disagreements or scheduling issues? What's appropriate or what's relevant for that particular ministry and tier level. Does it make sense?
Yeah, it does. And that's, in some corporate structures, that's exactly how it works.
Yeah.
Right? Like there are a lot of things, and this is something that it's a piece of feedback that I get a lot, right? Mm-hmm. So I have the opportunity to work with a lot of veterans. And because of that, there are a lot of people who have mentioned to me that our leadership development looks a little bit more militaristic than it has in other churches. And as I've talked to them about that, I was like, here's the thing. The military, if you look at all of their leadership stuff, particularly the stuff from their early 20th century, they're talking about using biblical principles in order to raise up leaders.
Right.
We've gotten away from some of that stuff, which is why what we do as a church may look a little bit more militaristic, because it's that whole thing. Like Moses was chosen by God and just got to be Moses, right? Joshua put in a lot of work before he became the one who led the Israelites into the promised land, right?
Absolutely.
And we don't really see any time in the scriptures, not to say it didn't happen, but we don't see any time in the scriptures where Joshua is going to God and he's like, hey, I got some serious problems with this Moses guy.
Right.
Like what he did with that rock just wasn't that cool.
Right.
So I think it's time for him to go, and you just need to put me in leadership. And we do have a lot of that, though, that happens, inside the church where people are like, hey, this isn't working. But it's not something we would try in the corporate world. Right. And if we did, we would anticipate that there would be some type of consequence, whether it was from, the person that we jumped over their head, or, that second level up where that guy's like, you really just need to deal with this about it. And you need to come talk to me about this nonsense. Like, I don't deal with mutinies.
Right.
Kind of a thing or whatever. So one of the things in particular that I think is interesting about what you said is that you are not picking leaders based off of who is going to work best with your style of leadership. And I think that that's a habit that we can get into. is looking at is like, hey, I only want A-level performers. I only want people that are going to be, absolutely self-motivated out of the gate, that they're going to be punctual, that they're going to be prepared, they're going to be top performers. And if you're wanting to get into leadership and you're not one of these people, I'm not going to be able to work well with you, because those are the only type of people that I work with, the only type of people that I like working with. We don't have the luxury of doing that. So how much of our egos as leaders do we need to set to the side so that, we can realize, hey, listen, maybe the reason that I don't stylistically match up with this person is because there's holes in my leadership game.
Sure.
Instead of me just looking at him and being like, well, as soon as you get better at X, Y, Z, then you can come and you can, be part of what God's doing at this church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, one of the constraints that we have whether we're planting, replanting, or revitalizing, is that we have to, this goes, back to my analogy with the cars, we have to play our hand with who we have. We don't have the luxury of drafting people in, right? And so you may want to have, to use a sports analogy, you may want to have McDonald's, All-Americans on your basketball squad. Well, you may just get the ones who graduated from high school and they had a capacity to play D1, but maybe not, at that McDonald's All-American level. They still can contribute and be helpful to the program, but you've got to coach them. And I think sometimes we can be a little too arrogant. We can be a little too demanding, because we read in a book somewhere that if somebody is not an A+, they ought not be on your team. Well, I think it's something to be said for, Jesus having taken, who he took and molded them, over 3 years to become men that changed the world. Yeah. And I think that we need to, be humble enough to recognize that we're still growing in our role, right? As a lead pastor, I know I'm still growing. That's how I ended up going back to school, because I recognize, and frankly, I told this to my elders, I recognize gaps in my leadership, in my ability to nurture and lead, the leaders in our church, right? Right. And so I need to get some help, right? And so I had to start in my own head first. And so, so I think it's important that we need to lay aside our egos and humble ourselves and recognize that there may be gaps in us. And if there are gaps in us, there are going to be gaps in the people that we lead. So we need to be humble enough to want to invest time in them and their leadership development so that they can grow to be the best that they can be, right? And in doing that, they end up being great in their position. And if not, they'll be great for the next position, right? As they pivot, or whether that's a lateral in the ministry or move up or even out in some ways, as we've had guys leave and, to go plant churches.
Yeah, well, I've got a friend who one of his favorite things to say is that you weren't always the rock star that you think you are.
Well,
and man, first off,
right.
I was too a rock star. So
literally, like literally,
it was a point in time when that was literally the case. But the thing that gets coupled with that is when we achieve a certain level of success, whether it's real or imagined. We start to ignore the developmental pieces that we really had to work on in order to get there.
Right.
And that leads me to my last question for today's episode is what's your lead time on leadership development? I know there are churches who were particularly like post-COVID. We went from 140 people who were meeting here every Sunday in January of 2020 to July of 2020 when there were 35 of our faithful saints who were coming, and that's what we built off of. it felt like in January we could invest in somebody for a year. We had a 52-week training that we were rolling out, that we were ready to go. And then just a few months later, it felt like if you were in the church for 6 days and you were committed to leadership, like you were getting a position.
That's right.
But that wasn't the healthiest thing to do either, right? So when you're looking at, rolling stuff out for leaders or working on leadership development, what's a good kind of rule of thumb timeline that we can put together?
Yeah, I don't even know if I have a good rule of thumb. I've been snagged so many times, especially by need, right? Like we need somebody, and you see someone that has the potential, and they act like they want to do it. Okay, that's it. Let's roll with them. And I've just been snagged so many times by it. So like our training venue for leadership is apprenticeship at the church.
Okay.
Right. So all of our current leaders are supposed to have an apprentice, right? With the idea that they're going to either take over your job, right? Because you're going to do something else or something, different. Or they're going to lateral out to another kind of responsibility. What I think is important is to figure out exactly what it is that you need of, say, leader A, right? What kinds of work responsibilities, what kind of character responsibilities, and then figure out how much time you need to kind of lay that out, right, from a training standpoint. So, for example, new preachers at our church, and we've got 15, right? So
which is in your congregation is how many? Like on a typical Sunday morning?
Between the two services, like around 400 or so.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's an insane amount of pastors to be at one church.
Yeah, man.
And how many of them would be considered like staff members?
Probably 6. Maybe.
So one of the reasons that I wanted to do this show in particular with you and have you share so much about this stuff is because you have an uncanny gift for building leaders, and your church is structured in such a way that this is something that y'all have naturally started to do.
Yeah.
But you've only naturally started to do it because it's become the culture of your church to do that.
Yeah.
And this is something that, I want our church to be able to do, right? We've got 100, and if we're running the same percentages, we should have like 4 or 5.
Right.
And we're working on getting the second one right now, right? And that's not to say that we have done anything that's inherently wrong. It's just that we have not made leadership development, particularly in our young men, part of the culture, and we're working to change that.
Sure.
So and I just want to highlight that it's incredible what God is doing at your church because of the culture that you guys have created by listening and following the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, amen. Yeah, thank you for that, brother. So like with the preachers, it could be anywhere from 6 months to 15 months, right? I kind of have a process that I take them through, and if they do it, consistently, and there are no snags, then it may be shorter. If not, or life happens, or we end up getting stuck on an issue that we need to work through, we just work through it until we feel they're ready. With respect to some of our ministry functions, all of our leaders go through Leadership 101, the leadership, leader Antioch, what is Antioch's heart and all this kind of stuff. We have a kind of a training that anybody can take. It's a couple hours, and at least that makes them eligible, right? Yeah. And so it depends on the ministry function. There are some ministries, the leadership, even though each function is critical to what we do overall in terms of the level of detail and emphasis and concern about how it will overall impact, the membership or guests or whatever, that may vary across, different ministries, right? So, being in our greeters ministry is a lot different from working in the nursery, right? And being responsible for that, just because of, one of them has a lot of legal implications because of the minors and yada yada yada, and so
background checks and all that stuff,
and all that kind of stuff that they have to be up to speed on. So I would think, just as a general matter, think about what it is that you need for that leader to have, and think about just points 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and for a training, how long would you feel like it would take to invest in them in this kind of way? I think, depending on the ministry function, 6 to 8 months, right, in terms of not necessarily keeping them from that, but considering them, watching them, training them, and then deploying them. That's probably good, right? Because you can use them on an interim basis, right, as a proving ground. That's one of the things that we do for some of our deacon candidates is we don't necessarily put them in a junior deacon program. We have them serve as a family care leader to demonstrate whether or not they can fulfill the deacon's role, right? And then they become eligible when we open up and need to add deacons. So I think what I want to leave with the team is what is going to help you accomplish what it is that you think you want to have happen with respect to a particular leader. And I know I'm kind of talking around the point because I don't know that you can say 6 months they ought to be good. Well, not if they're unfaithful, right?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I would think identify those characteristics, figure out what skill set and traits that you want to instill, and how long do you think is reasonable to convey the importance of each one of those points and traits and characteristics, and use that as a measure, right?
Man, I think that's so good because I do remember early on, particularly when I took over the role as pastor here, it's because I was the same age as you were. I was 31 whenever I took it over, right?
Yeah.
And there's so much stuff that you don't know.
Yeah.
But you figured since you had been there and in those positions that you know enough about it. And finding those leaders that were consistent, and I love that you mentioned that was such an important thing, that like if this person can't come to church 6 weeks in a row throughout any point in a given year, they may not be the best leadership candidate.
That's right.
But if you think that they are, then a little bit of investment in figuring things out and building some relationship there, you'll find that some of those people that only come 4 out of every 6 weeks, if they know that you are that you're for them, if they know that you're willing to invest in them in their lives, well, pretty soon that person can go, hey, you know what, I haven't been here for 6 straight weeks ever in the course of the 2 years I've been coming to this church. Well, now all of a sudden they get 6 months where they haven't missed a Sunday or a midweek program, or that they're volunteering at everything. Well, now all of a sudden you got a place to work with, and so it's those little bits of investment and figuring those things out. Because if they've got the potential and they haven't been here 4 out of 6 weeks, then you can't expect them, to whenever you're like, hey, I want to put you into a leadership role. You
Listen,
can't be upset when
they miss 2 weeks.
Yeah, right. When they've been steady for 3, and then they're like,
exactly.
hey, I wasn't able to make it, or not feeling well, or whatever. And we run into this problem, especially when we're developing younger leaders.
Yeah.
And particularly with second generation or third generation believers.
Okay.
Right. Is that we get the text on Saturday night. They're like, hey, I'm not going to be able to help out with X. I'm not feeling well, been a little sick to my stomach. And I'll have the conversation with them. It's like, all right, did you get the flu or did you get a bar flu?
Well.
And they're like, well, I'm still kind of struggling and I don't really know how I feel about this, that, and the other. I'm like, hey, cool. But that also lets me know, like, no go. They may have their stuff looking great on Sunday mornings,
right,
and they may look wonderful on paper, but they're not there yet from a heart standpoint.
Right.
And those conversations suck to have, especially when, if they are second or third generation and the first generation or the first 2 generations are going to the church, that you got to find a way to call it out where you're not letting mom and dad and grandma know, like, hey, listen, your grandbaby got a little too excited at a birthday party,
right,
for a friend, and then they weren't able to show up to fulfill their position in worship ministry. But you also have to be willing to work with those folks to meet them where they're at and to come at it and help them with those standards.
That's it. I was just about to say, for that person, maybe they need to go back into the incubator, right? Sometimes we just tend to throw them away because, the issues that we're dealing with in ministry, a lot of stuff, we got to do some stuff like right now within the short term, but maybe we put them in the incubator, right? Like maybe we continue to work with them outside of that leadership, that formal leadership role, right, and continue to nurture them and prepare them for it. The second thing is that same person has got bar flu. If they came and said, hey, I'm not feeling well, I quote unquote got bar flu, but I talked to person A, they're going to do this thing while that's a completely different deal.
Totally different scenario.
I mean, you're still kind of irritated that they're not there, but they're also demonstrating leadership because they've already provided a solution for a problem, frankly, that they created. Right? So it's not always a straight and black and white, right? It is being able to see leadership manifest itself in different ways, even if it's growing out of a negative kind of situation.
Yeah, and so much of that, the influence that we want to have comes out of the relationship that we've got. And man, I think that may be the next topic that we tackle is what does it take to build a relationship? Well, thank you guys for listening to the Church Resource, where we talk about the best resources for church leaders and lay people. If you've got a recommendation for us, something you want us to look at, you can email us at thechurchresource@gmail.com. And until then, you guys have good, give, and we'll see you.
Holla. See you.